I am going to organize now the opening of the next roundtable. We're going to ask our Prime Minister to stay here, but I'm like to call Danielle Dubrac and Bertrand BADIE to the stage, please. Thank you, Pascal, and thank you, Sylvie. Please, you can applaud them for the quality of their interventions and their contribution to our work. So we now have on stage Danielle Dubrac, who is the president of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry of the Department of Seine-Saint-Denis. And we wanted her because she wants to talk to us about the future issues and specifically what was defined by Jean-Paul Belbèze on the increasing social inequalities in the world. We can see the gaps between the growth rates of different countries, and those gaps are getting wider. This is very important, and this is seen as well in our country. And the Department of Seine-Saint-Denis is one department where we can see most clearly those inequalities, and today they are particularly striking. So Danielle is the president of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and she also represents companies in the Economic and Social Council of the Republic. Then we have Bertrand BADIE, who is a professor emeritus of the Universities of Political Science in Paris, and he will most likely have some comments on the overarching themes of our forum, because he's very close to international thinking and maybe to the international revolution that we see on the international stage. And we're going to talk to him as well about the content of his forthcoming book, which will be published very soon. So let's start with you, Danielle Dubrac. What does this rise in inequalities look like to you? The differences between the social structures, the rise of inequalities, the rise of violence, the rise of brute force, really, and this position that we can see being strengthened not only in French society, but a bit everywhere on the planet. Thank you. Thank you very much. What we can say, and you already said it, President, the environmental challenges and the fight against inequalities cannot be just seen at the level of globalization, but at the level of our planet, really. And there are two topics today. There is COVID, of course, and there is the inequalities when faced with this pandemic, but also the inequalities when faced with climate change. But there are also other inequalities, even though previous governments and current governments are trying their best to reduce the level of inequalities. This is a very important topic in France and everywhere. Now let's talk about the inequalities linked to the pandemic. We see that different projects have been postponed, that access to decent accommodation has been really impeded. But unfortunately, some projects didn't take place in France, in Europe, in the world. We used to have 137 million poor people in the world, and the aim of the sustainable goals was to eradicate poverty by 2030. And obviously, with COVID, we're going to have an additional 124 million poor people. And this is an important topic, this topic of inequalities, because if we don't all drive in the same direction, we're not going to reach our goal. And this is an important subject. I said that there's going to be an additional 124 million poor people in the world, according to the figures that we've received. But in France, when we are trying to reach the SDGs, we need to eradicate poverty in our country, or at least limit the level of poverty by 2030, because we had a 15 years plan from 2015, but now we've taken, we're late because of the pandemic. there are 5 million French people who had less than 800 euro income per month before the pandemic. The median income is 1,700 euros per month, but by 2030, we could have this strategy to eradicate poverty so that people can have so many percent of the median income. There are many challenges, and throughout the day, we've talked about inequalities linked to climate change. So we know that extreme events are going to be more frequent, larger. We're going to have to adapt, and some people will be able to adapt, and others won't be able to do so. We know that this widening of the gap when we talk of inequalities is happening. It is important to have a strategy that will reduce inequalities, and that is directly linked to the climate change strategies. This is what we called the climate justice. And those goals of climate justice means that any climate change could not widen these inequalities further. In France, we need a strategy on this. This is valid for our territory, but this is also valid for the whole world and for the overseas territories. Civil society, in general, is directly involved. Now, how can we integrate climate change, the fight against climate change, with the fight against inequalities? Now, we do have a climate change plan. That's important because in the previous climate plan, which is the carbon neutrality by 2050, we need to have it. When it comes to emissions by buildings, greenhouse gas emission, that is, we are talking about an increased consumption. So we need to limit the consumption, the energy consumption of buildings. For that, we need renovating. And for that, we need public policies for social housing. We need to have the means to do so. And for people who are in a difficult energy situation, more efforts must be made. If we want to have carbon neutrality by 2050, well, then, of course, we need to help the low-income households. And we need to assess the policies in the light of the benefits that are acquired by this 20% of the population. We also have inequalities linked to health. That was particularly impactful for women during the pandemic because they had to postpone some tests and some of their conditions worsened. And we need to see what is remote working for women. What is the impact on women? Can we help them with childcare, for example, so that the impact of remote working or home working will be lessened? On health? We have seen some striking examples that people have died in larger numbers in low or vulnerable categories. The aim has always been education and prevention, but maybe we could systematically take into account personal and social economic factors that have an impact on individual health status. Before the pandemic, 15% of people didn't use internet. So there's also a technological inequality here. With the confinement and the lockdown, of course, we have seen the increase of technological use. Maybe we need a public service. Of course, a lot of things are done digitally in the cloud, but maybe we need a transition phase to help people who are not yet digital savvy. We know that a poor person needs to wait 6 generations before that person can reach a middle-class status. And companies have a role to play there for the social lift up of those categories. We need to stop the widening of those inequalities. And in early childhood, we must find solutions, childcare solutions, for example, for children with special needs. And we need to better manage the transition between early childhood childcare and primary school. There is also inequalities when it comes to equipment. Some people have the right equipment and others do not have that equipment. So that has an impact on education possibilities. Regions and schools have tried to help, but it is not easy to have equality of treatment, of digital treatment between all schools. So we need to have not only technological equipment, but also digital skills to help the different schools. There are all those difficulties. I have 3 inequalities still on my list and then I will stop. There is inequalities when it comes to access to education and access to vocational training, because we see everywhere in the world that there has been an increase of unemployment and some households have seen their income go down. We really need to have a good vocational integration. And we know that every other company is looking for staff, and there are people who are badly trained or who are in the wrong areas. So we need to help people who have never had a job before. We need to give them training or new training or retraining so that they can all have a job. And for those who are early school leavers, we need to give them vocational training so they can have better possibilities and find a new job. We need to help young people, and that will help us to eliminate these inequalities in terms of access to education and jobs. There are also territorial inequalities. In this room, we do have some elected representatives that do understand the territorial inequalities, and this is directly associated with social inequalities. Maybe we can see how we can change the equation here. The state cannot do everything, and regions cannot do everything, and municipal councils cannot do everything, but we need to try to reach this equality in the same territory. For example, if you're in a large urban center, we will see that some people are in great difficulties as neighbors of people who do not have those difficulties. So very often the local policies are linked to projects, but in some cases the regret is that we do not have enough public services. Now, some public services have been closed for different reasons that I can't assess here, but we have to cover all the urban districts, but also rural areas and semi-rural areas so that we can have this equitable access. We must eliminate those inequality on the territorial basis. And then we have the green taxonomy at EU level. There is a criteria set by the EU that categorizes companies on the basis of their capacity to no longer damage the environment. So they want to foster economic activity that are not going to further climate change, because climate change, of course, is leading to inequalities, but we don't want to have social taxonomy. We need to have a categorization that includes everything, social, environmental factors, so that we can foster projects that will have the greatest social impact. You're talking about globalization in the sense of planetization, and it's very important for companies. We see it in the ARSE, companies that are highly performant are companies that have worked on their CSR. And when there is a general shock, there is this solidarity of customers and of staff. All academic studies have demonstrated that. I will end by saying that, first of all, we need to raise awareness in civil society on the SDGs. I've talked about inequalities and poverty, but as you know, there are 17 SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, and we also need to work with companies, because that's how we can reach those SDGs. So that's what I wanted to say as an introduction. I wanted to list the different inequalities that are not new, that existed before COVID, but that have become worse during COVID. Thank you, Danielle Dubrac. We wanted to have your view before giving the floor to Bertrand BADIE, because Bertrand BADIE is often talking and questioning the traditional international relations, in particular the rise of civil society and the rise of the different concerns that we have just mentioned, because it is because of those concerns that we have social movements, that we have a social impetus and different public opinions, which lead to a destabilization of power. And this is not always representative in what we see. There is this lag between the international stage and what we can see at the level of our societies. So, as a last intervention, you're going to talk, Professor, in a structured manner, as you always do, and you're going to give us some ideas. And how can we imagine that multilateralism, that is now 75 years old, is getting quite ancient, it is getting a little bit slower and heavier, maybe social dynamism, this social impetus could be a contributor in a positive way to multilateralism. You have the floor.
Je suis professeur émérite.
Well, I am a professor emeritus of Sciences Po. I've been doing this for 40 years. It's good that I've retired now, because the denomination of international relations is problematic. There shouldn't be professors of international relations anymore, but of international and intersocial relations, because we're looking at a very profound break in terms of our culture, our Western culture of international relations. What I want to say on this final note, because you've given me this privilege or danger of rounding this off, is to talk about the transformation of the culture of international relations. And I was very happy to hear the former Prime Minister Philippe talking about this sleepwalking approach. That's the problem. The problem is that the world is changing fundamentally, perhaps has been changing for the last 5 centuries. And this is a break that's been a long time in the making, but legal texts and diplomatic formulas and indeed project programs of political actors do not change. They remain impregnated with this old culture. You talked about multilateralism. Well, the multilateralism that we have, and which I worship because it is a great fortune for us, is linked to this old setup. Lloyd George said in 1919, talk about the European concertation of coming together as a really powerful, and in 1945, in the 1945 San Francisco Charter reaffirmed that, the legalization of power and therefore the right of veto. Ladies and gentlemen, what I want to say to you today, and I think is essential to say, that we have entered into a new phase globally, characterized by the fact that the social world is going much faster than the political world, and the changes in the social sphere are so much faster. You've talked about all these dizzying moments and political And policy dynamics are constantly put on the back foot by these changes, these dizzying changes in society, which are laying down the rules for this new way to do things internationally. And our international system is caught up in this dissonance between the this vigorous social movement and this resilience of the political system, which refuses to budge and to move forward. This means that social actors are constantly getting ahead of political actors in setting the international agenda. And whether we're talking about food, health, environment, socio-economic matters, the influence of the social strategy is much greater than that of the political strategy. Conflicts and wars are being seen as if they were still phenomena that could be dealt with by strategic paradigms. When we're talking about conflicts of socials, would you look at Afghanistan, look at Israel, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, each and every time it's profound social imbalances that are leading to these geopolitical conflicts, and this just aggravating this dissonance, as we've seen on the debate on Afghanistan today. And why is this happening? Because in the West, for the last 500 or 600 years, there's no specific date when this began. Can't say in 1668, we invented the first international system, didn't we? It's true. In the West, at the time, we were de facto the only power worldwide to have this. You have empires, yes, there have been empires, but they're not really international networks or systems. As we come into the Renaissance, coming out of the Middle Ages, there's an unprecedented situation, which was the competence between juxtaposed sovereign states. Who is going to organize circulation or driving? French luminary did that. And this was a genuine nutshell at the time and existed up to the Cold War, and that was geopolitics. And once again, Raymond said that the multi-secular relation between sovereign states. Now, that all came to an end because of three breaks, which have never really been taken into account. The first is decolonialization. That basically gave birth to globalization, because it went from 51 members of the United Nations, which was almost exclusively American and European, to 193 today. And globalization says we're going to have a multicultural world where most of members will never have known this Westphalian culture and Westphalian period, which is alien to them, it's foreign to them. And look at China and Chinese history, current contemporary history. Now, this globalization, this de facto globalization, has brought in a whole series of variables. Sociological, in terms of the organization of big world balances, and the first links up perfectly well to what the previous speaker has just said. A world which is no longer this relatively balanced world between powers, like that of the sacred traditional international relations, but is a world of fundamental imbalances. Africa, where you've got per capita GDP of $400, rather than Luxembourg, which has 6,000. And there you have a distortion which is somehow going to have to be managed. So these world inequalities has become the very top of international agendas. and the profound factors of all the tensions and this lack of understanding, these lacks of understanding, I like this point, which are behind these disjunctures. And international governance, world governance comes in. You look at independent former colonies, the old powers basically confiscate their governance once they become independent. I'm going to leave the G20 to one side, despite what I said before. I don't think the G20 has never really worked, but that's just an aside. Second break, decolonialization. Let me just add something that was being developed here. You've got the whole question of humiliation. Polarization, bipolarization is not just a de facto globalization, it's globalization by default. So up to 1989, the international game or balance of powers was a traditional, but when the Berlin Wall came down, this whole structure crumbled. This balance of forces crumbled, and the battleground of power moves from Europe to Africa and to Asia, and the force is no longer what lays down the law. Look at what's happening in Afghanistan. Let's stay there. Let me give you a scoop. Taliban militias are less powerful than the US Army, but nonetheless, as in decolonization, as in Vietnam, Somalia, Iraq, Sahel, they are the strongest in terms of standing up for themselves unless they are defeated. Now, if we look at the disappearance of three major concepts, key concepts, which I don't think should be used anymore, they should perhaps to be redefined. The concept of war, replaced by conflict. Alliance, a concept replaced by partnerships. And the concept of power, which has now morphed into powerlessness following the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the third break is the techno-sociological globalization. Globalization is not just an economic, it's been taken on board by the economic side of things, but it's initially technological. The three key elements, Mahbouba has developed the first very well, inclusion. We're all in the same boat. Second phenomenon, which has been very well developed here, and I'm very pleased to hear it, that's interdependence. Yesterday, we were talking about this with Mr. BADIE when we were talking, preparing today's speech. And he said that's in contrast to the question of sovereignty. So this no longer makes any sense. Certainly, according to the tradition that Jean-Pierre has mentioned in his book, and particularly in this interdependence, there is a strong revolution that appears, and I want to really draw your attention to that, and that is the passage from a national concept of security to a global concept of security. So from national security, which has governed international relations up to 1989, security is protecting the nation, to global security, which qualifies that as humanity as a whole. Global security has nothing to do with the law on global security, as MPs like to call it, and lawmakers like to make it. Look at the English-speaking tradition. My Japanese colleagues saying, "What's the matter with you in France? You talk about global security. To talk about protecting police in the middle of demonstrations." And I was chewing on that for 3 weeks and I could not get my head around it. How can you twist that concept to model it into something which will just keep the public interest? It's global. I said, oh, it's not that. Don't say that. They're not going to understand you. So I'm talking about globalized powers. That's why I chose those words. Then the third challenge of this techno-sociological globalization is the end of the principle of territoriality in the strict sense of the word. We talked about territoriality a lot these days, but we're talking about nation status that is giving way to a different paradigm. And on this, I will round off. There are 4 things at stake here. First of all, the first question that any governor asks themselves is, how can we manage globalization? That's very interesting because we can see how Western powers have found it hard to really understand what globalization is about. They've seen it very much within the focus of a national approach, thinking of national diplomacy and US diplomacy, rather than looking at China. The Chinese understand globalization in a very different way. And perhaps this, what the Western powers would say is what Branko Milanovic would have said if he were present here. That in fact, you look at the emerging powers to understand that. What I would say to my students, when you ask a question about international relations, the first thing to say is to talk about the links to globalization by the seen by China and seen by the rest is very different. Secondly, actors in this new game are more and more social actors, whether we're talking about the Arab Spring overturned the political situation, or sectorial actors, big companies, NGOs, and so on, but also individuals. The reflection on individuals coming into an international system is fundamental, and the individual that comes into the international system is either a communicating individual, a migrant individual, and a suffering individual. Social suffering becomes the variable that is most permeates international relations, and this work on social suffering, which doesn't make all that much sense at the time when the big states had a monopoly of international relations when they're occupied by actors of the same size, but in this communication period where everyone sees everyone and the poor see the rich. You see that within a city, you see that in urban planning. Go to certain places like I did a couple of years ago, you see the proximity of poor people with rich people and how they see rich people. Thirdly, the birth of global key issues. The United Nations Development Agency has seen this, the UNCTAD, the Trade and Development, said we're looking at food security, we're looking at environmental security, economic, cultural, individual, institutional securities. Do you often hear political actors campaigning, mentioning these 7 securities of the UNCTAD? And if terrorism kills between 10,000 and 40,000 people, famine kills 9 million people a year, and 8 million of youth deaths. And you can only deal with collective problems with collective policies. And that concerns global governance and building a new equation of international relations coming out of Westphalia is moving away from a zero-sum game. I win means you lose, you win means I lose. We're outside that paradigm now. Now, what I win, you can win. What I lose, you lose. We're in a win-win or lose-lose situation. And it's been said a number of times today that policy situations, when you look at a global issue like the health crisis, this is something very worrying. We've seen the nationalization of these global issues. is very scary. It's given birth to these dysfunctions that we're currently seeing. The war of masks or the war of vaccines. I don't want this nationalization of these global issues because this is going to lead to new variants developing in the global south. This contradiction between this zero-sum game and effectively this nationalization of global issues is the source of all the difficulties we face. And problems get more and more complicated. We only talk about things in a very rhetorical and political way. I remember in March 2020, a journalist said, what's going to happen in the world after all this? I said, well, what's going to happen is we're going to see a reform of the WHO. Something is going to change inside the WHO. We're going to strengthen health rules, international health rules. RSI, we're going to set up a task force. Everything is going to be done very fast because it's very urgent. But actually, nothing has happened. You're waiting for the G7 to take a decision on that. And in fact, that's the expression of the contradictions that we face. And let me just round off by saying that this socialization of the world is also transformation of conflicts. The old conflicts, Kosovian conflicts, North Korea, South Korea, India, Pakistan, but the real conflicts that worry us today are socially based conflicts. How can we understand the Sahel conflict without taking into account the effects of the rivalry between different groups, and the crisis of property, and it's all there. And there's a new grammar, there's a new language being created, and most of princes, people don't want to use, especially in the West. Okay, I'm being told not to say that, so the princes fear this because this social watershed will affect their resources.
Profondeur et de prendre des résolutions robustes sur les sécurités humaines.
Some that the Security Council has refused to do. For instance, when it had to do with the Ebola crisis, the food crisis, where there are millions and millions of deaths per year. 2 years ago, the Russian delegate to the Security Council said that it would be counterproductive for the Security Council to deal with environmental crisis issues. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think that is high time that we start looking at things differently, through different lenses. And if we do so, we may just be able to act differently. And then things kind of, the wheels get in motion very fast, either because of fear. For instance, after some air disasters, we found the importance, very quickly realized the importance of having a world civil aviation authority. And that can happen in these current contexts as well. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, dear professor. And I just wanted to say that you said yourself that your speech was very long-winded, but that's not at all the way we look at it. It actually is really a lot of food for thought for us to discuss. So we see that international relations and non-governmental organizations and different kinds of international policies are more and more accessible to others, to all kinds of people, because of social networks and because of online presence. And a lot of people, that's just one way where we can have a new way of looking at things and finding a way of finding solutions. So there might be some people who have things to add. So we had a few people who wanted to take the floor. For instance, Jean-Claude Beaujour, who's the vice president of France America, who wanted to say something. Well, I invite you up here for a few moments, because I'd like to be able to have a more balanced discussion. So naturally, I don't need to remind you that you don't have much time, but we would nevertheless like to hear from you. And also Gérard Miclinquant, who also asked to take the floor, who is an expert on security issues. And I would be remiss in not allowing him to join us as well. And I know that there are many other people in the room who would like to take the floor to say something, but I thought that these people would be a good complement to our panel. So Jean-Claude, what would you like to say? Do you have anything you'd like to add to the different exchanges and debates we heard today? And given your perspective on the United States as a French person, thank you, Prime Minister. Thank you, former Prime Minister, ma'am and sir. There are two things that stand out for me. I will, of course, touch on the United States. The first thing is that I'm pleased to hear all of the different speeches, especially the last one that I'm familiar with already when I heard him at Sciences Po. But there are two things that are important to remember, is that we're going into a new presidential election at a moment where we hear a lot of talk about sovereignty. At a moment when our nations have never been more dependent on each other. And we saw how we could be completely affected by this tiny virus that started halfway around the world. So that shows how interdependent we are. We also saw that no matter how much means, money, resources you have at your disposal, sometimes it's not enough to get you out of difficult situations. In terms of immigration, we know that there are great migratory flows that are directly linked to the climate crisis. For instance, in the United States, we see how the climate crisis is one of the main reasons behind the huge flows of migrants to the United States. The final point, Professor, you talked about inequality. And inequality now is the overriding point in all international relations. And you're right, because there are many issues that no longer are cross borders. Whether you in New York, Paris, or Shanghai, you are interconnected to people all around the planet, and people support less and less the idea that there's so much inequality, that there are such very, very wealthy people in some places right next to people who have nothing. I'd like to finish by saying that the issues that bother us, that concern us, are the same ones that the President of the United States, Joe Biden, and the United States that worry them. We talked about how China, somebody mentioned how China is obsessed with the United States, not just because it's not just rooted in fear. But when I speak with Americans, and I'm not just talking about people in Washington or New York, but your average Joe, so to speak. But what concerns them is having a job, being able to leave a better world for their children. And what's so tragic is that today, for many people who live or study in the United States, we're not sure if we are leaving, if our children are going to be better off. For instance, my daughter who's in Chicago, it doesn't think that she's going to be able to do as well as be as successful as I am in life, so to speak. So the concerns are the same in many places. And I'll finish by saying, yes, we have to have a worldwide governance. And also, I'm still very much attached to Europe, but we need to stop our sides, taking sides. And that's why we're heading into a wall vis-a-vis the United States and China and that sort of thing. The fact of the matter is that we don't know what the future holds. And we need to be very lucid, because we don't know where we're going, but we need to get there somehow. Thank you very much. The former Prime Minister had a very dense chapter in his book about a topic about which you know a great deal. Maybe you could talk to us about it. Thank you very much. Former Prime Minister, you said it yourself, we live in a dangerous world. And you also talked about the traps that we don't see. And so I'd like to dovetail off of your last point, Professor. And in the context of thinking about security, we've seen this over the course of last week, pictures and images that have come out of Kabul. And we saw that ISIS, most recently, throughout the evacuation process in Kabul, ISIS struck yet again. And so we need to talk so some of you talked about the fact that, so we have these two powers and that Europe could be the counterbalance, the third. But there are some sides that aren't playing fair. And they are playing dirty, and they're transnational sides or powers that prey off of people in difficulty or vulnerable people, and they are in favor of a radically different set of morals from ours. And you know, in the end of the day, we all kind of think the same things, and we want to organize our societies in the same way, but radicals, this other side that we're up against, ISIS, in the Sahel, in Mozambique, and the Taliban and elsewhere. But even these forces are even present within our societies here, and they do not think the same way we do. I'm often asked to speak on camera, on television, and I often say it's just a shame, because the only time I'm ever asked to speak is when things are not going well. And that's unfortunately, there's another trap, and that is many times people only think about acting against forces, unsafe forces in situations of security when a bomb goes off or when there's a problem of security. And we need to be very careful of that. Thank you, gentlemen, for both of your reflections, and we will certainly have the opportunity to hear more from you in the future.